Have you ever wondered if what we know today could change tomorrow? What if the truths we hold dear aren't as absolute as we think? In this video, we're diving into a mind-bending concept from Friedrich Nietzsche, the fluidity of knowledge. Nietzsche, one of philosophy's most influential thinkers, challenged the very idea of fixed truths. He believed that knowledge isn't static, it's constantly evolving, shaped by our perspectives, culture, and history. So, how does this change the way we see the world? Can we ever truly know anything for certain? Today, we'll unpack Nietzsche's radical ideas on how knowledge is more like a river than a rock, always flowing and shifting with new interpretations. Stay with us as we explore how these groundbreaking thoughts can impact everything from science to ethics and even how we live our everyday lives. Let's get started.
So let's start.
Nietzsche's rejection of absolute truths leads directly to the broader philosophical movement known as relativism. Relativism, at its core, is the belief that knowledge, truth, and moral values are not universal, unchanging, or objective, but are instead shaped by factors such as culture, history, and individual perspective. Nietzsche's ideas about truth as something contingent and subjective challenge the traditional, long-standing belief that there exists a singular, absolute truth that applies to everyone regardless of time, place, or circumstance. Relativism can be broken down into various forms, such as epistemic relativism and moral relativism. Nietzsche's challenge primarily lies in these areas. Epistemic relativism suggests that knowledge itself is not universally valid or universally accessible. Instead, it varies depending on one's viewpoint, experiences, and societal context. According to Nietzsche, humans are not capable of fully understanding a universal truth because each individual is confined to a particular perspective, shaped by their upbringing, education, and cultural influences. As a result, knowledge is inherently fragmented and subjective. This aligns with Nietzsche's famous assertion that there are no eternal facts, only interpretations. Moral relativism follows the same thread. Nietzsche critiqued traditional moral systems, particularly those grounded in religious or metaphysical doctrines, which claimed absolute moral truths. In contrast, Nietzsche believed that morality is not universal or divinely ordained. Instead, moral codes are human-made constructs, formed through social conditioning, historical shifts, and power dynamics. What is considered good or evil is not fixed, it changes depending on time, society, and the individual. For example, what one society might deem virtuous, another may see as immoral. Nietzsche's work critiques the imposition of a singular, universal moral code on the diverse moral landscapes of human societies. Nietzsche's relativism is not to be confused with nihilism, the belief that nothing has value or meaning. While relativism challenges the idea of fixed, absolute truths, Nietzsche still advocated for the creation of personal meaning and values. He promoted a form of life-affirming relativism, encouraging individuals to embrace their own perspectives and create their own values, free from external authorities or rigid moral systems. One significant consequence of Nietzsche's relativism is the rejection of objectivity in both science and ethics. Science, while often considered a domain of objective truth, is also influenced by human perspective and interpretation. Just as historians interpret events from certain vantage points, scientists interpret data within the framework of their theories, which can evolve over time. Nietzsche's challenge to the objectivity of knowledge invites a deeper reflection on the ways in which we construct knowledge, recognizing that it is always influenced by subjective, cultural, and historical forces. In broader terms, Nietzsche's relativism aligns with the ideas of many postmodern thinkers who argue that what we consider to be truth is, in fact, shaped by societal power structures, language, and historical context. His critique of absolute truths calls for a shift away from the search for universal answers toward an acknowledgement of the plurality of perspectives and the fluidity of human knowledge. The consequences of Nietzschean relativism are far-reaching. It not only affects our understanding of truth and morality but also has profound implications for how we approach knowledge, power, and human flourishing. If truth is not fixed but instead subjective and ever-changing, then human beings must actively engage with their world, continually reinterpreting and reassessing their beliefs, values, and understandings. This dynamic engagement offers a freedom to define and redefine oneself in a world without absolute certainties, offering a radical shift from the past search for immutable truths to a future in which knowledge is constantly in flux, shaped by the perspectives of those who seek it. Nietzsche's concept of perspectivism is central to his philosophical rejection of absolute truths. Perspectivism asserts that all knowledge, truth, and reality are contingent on the perspectives through which they are perceived. Rather than a single, objective truth that can be universally applied, Nietzsche argues that truth is always mediated by the individual's experiences, context, and subjective lens. This idea shifts the emphasis from a search for universal, unchanging truths to an understanding that knowledge is constructed and inherently influenced by perspective. At the heart of perspectivism is the belief that there is no one singular viewpoint from which to understand the world. Every individual, shaped by their own history, culture, psychological makeup, and experiences, interprets reality in a unique way. Nietzsche uses the metaphor of the mountain to illustrate this. Each person climbs a different side of the mountain, and as they ascend, their view of the peak, and thus of the mountain itself, changes. What one person sees as the pinnacle may differ significantly from another's view, depending on their position, vantage point, and interpretation. For Nietzsche, truth is not objective or external to the human subject. Instead, it is something that is always interpreted through the lens of individual perspective. He argues that every individual sees the world through their own set of biases, filters, and cognitive frameworks. Therefore, what one person perceives as true is simply their interpretation of reality, based on the particular conditions and contexts of their life. This brings Nietzsche into conflict with traditional epistemology, which holds that objective, absolute truth can be discovered and known. Nietzsche believed that the very notion of objective truth is flawed because it overlooks the subjectivity inherent in human experience. Knowledge is not a matter of uncovering universal facts but of interpreting and reinterpreting the world through one's unique vantage point. The implications of perspectivism are profound, especially when applied to the pursuit of knowledge and the nature of reality. If truth is always interpreted through individual perspectives, it follows that different people, cultures, and societies will have vastly different conceptions of what is true. This concept encourages an appreciation of the multiplicity of worldviews and suggests that all knowledge is partial, dependent on the perspective from which it is derived. Nietzsche's perspectivism also challenges the traditional notion of a neutral or objective observer. It suggests that there is no such thing as an entirely unbiased, impartial viewpoint because every observer is shaped by their own context. This is particularly relevant in fields like history, politics, and social sciences, where historical events, political decisions, and social structures are often interpreted in radically different ways by different groups of people. What one historian or political theorist views as a fact may be seen as a distortion or ideological narrative by another, demonstrating the power of perspective in shaping what we accept as truth. Moreover, perspectivism directly relates to Nietzsche's critique of traditional philosophy and religion. Philosophers, religious authorities, and scientists have long claimed to possess access to ultimate, universal truths, often presenting their views as objective and indisputable. Nietzsche, however, believed that these absolute truths were merely the dominant interpretations of particular groups, often serving to reinforce power structures and societal norms. For example, religious doctrines that claim to offer the ultimate truth about existence are, from Nietzsche's perspective, merely one set of interpretations created by particular historical and cultural conditions. At the same time, Nietzsche's perspectivism does not imply relativism without responsibility. While truth may be subjective, Nietzsche does not argue that all viewpoints are equally valid or that truth can be reduced to mere opinion. Instead, he urges individuals to critically examine their perspectives and to recognize the contingent nature of their beliefs. He emphasizes the importance of the will to power, the drive to create and assert one's own values, rather than passively accepting those imposed by others. In this way, Nietzsche's perspectivism is not a form of nihilism or passive relativism, but rather an invitation to embrace one's subjective experience and actively shape one's reality. Nietzsche's perspectivism also influences his approach to self-overcoming. He advocates for individuals to challenge and transcend their current understanding of the world, constantly striving to adopt new perspectives that lead to greater self-awareness and personal growth. This process of transformation is ongoing, as one's perspective must evolve as the individual gains new experiences and insights. In this sense, Nietzsche's perspectivism is deeply tied to his call for the continual recreation of the self. In the larger scope of Nietzsche's philosophy, perspectivism serves as a foundation for his broader epistemological project, one that embraces fluidity, dynamism, and subjectivity in the quest for truth. Rather than seeking a final, absolute truth, Nietzsche proposes that the pursuit of knowledge is always an evolving process, shaped by the interplay of diverse perspectives and the individual's continual reinterpretation of reality. This makes truth a dynamic and shifting concept, rather than a fixed, immutable entity, challenging the idea that we can ever arrive at a final, unquestionable understanding of the world. Nietzsche's skepticism of absolute truths and his emphasis on perspectivism laid the groundwork for the development of postmodernism, a philosophical movement that challenges traditional ideas of objective reality, universal truths, and grand narratives. Postmodernism, much like Nietzsche's philosophy, questions the possibility of accessing any universal or timeless truths, arguing instead that knowledge is always subjective, socially constructed, and deeply tied to the historical, cultural, and power dynamics of the moment. Postmodernism emerged in the mid-20th century as a reaction to the Enlightenment and the modernist movements that had emphasized reason, science, and objective truth as means of uncovering universal facts. While modernism sought to build knowledge based on solid, empirical foundations and rationality, postmodernism deconstructs these assumptions, suggesting that what we consider truth is always shaped by context, power structures, and language. In this way, postmodern thinkers like Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, and Jean-François Lyotard expanded upon Nietzsche's critique of absolute truths, ultimately embracing relativism and subjectivity. The relationship between Nietzsche and postmodernism is clear. Nietzsche's declaration that there are no eternal facts, as there are no absolute truths, anticipates key ideas of postmodern thought. Nietzsche's perspectivism, which emphasizes the contingent, interpretative nature of truth, parallels the postmodern view that knowledge is always produced through particular social, cultural, and linguistic filters. Postmodernism builds on Nietzsche's ideas by highlighting how knowledge is not an objective reflection of reality, but a construct heavily influenced by power, language, and ideology. One of the most crucial aspects of postmodernism's challenge to truth is its rejection of grand narratives, the overarching, universal explanations for history, society, or knowledge that were dominant in modernist thought. Thinkers like Lyotard argued that there is no single, unifying narrative that can explain the entirety of human experience. Instead, history is made up of fragmented, competing stories, each of which represents a different perspective and serves particular social or political functions. This rejection of grand narratives mirrors Nietzsche's critique of universal systems of meaning, such as religion, morality, and political ideologies, that claim to hold the definitive answers to life's most profound questions. Another important aspect of postmodernism is its emphasis on the role of language in shaping reality. Nietzsche's philosophy, particularly his ideas on the metaphysical interpretation of language, laid the groundwork for later postmodern thinkers who argue that language does not merely describe the world but actively shapes how we experience and understand it. For Derrida, this idea led to the development of deconstruction, a method of analyzing texts and systems of thought to reveal how they are constructed through language and how they are inherently unstable and contradictory. In this framework, language becomes a tool of power. What is true is not an objective fact but is constructed through discourse, and these constructions can be deconstructed to reveal their contingency. Power and knowledge are also central themes in postmodern thought, closely linked to Nietzsche's exploration of how truth is shaped by those who hold power. Michel Foucault, a key figure in postmodernism, expanded on Nietzsche's analysis by showing how truth and knowledge are inextricably linked to power structures. Foucault's analysis of institutions like prisons, hospitals, and schools reveals that what we consider to be knowledge is often produced by these institutions to maintain social control. Nietzsche, too, had explored the ways in which religious and political institutions used claims to absolute truth to dominate individuals, and his critique of these power dynamics resonates in Foucault's work. Postmodernism's rejection of objective truth and emphasis on cultural relativism also echoes Nietzsche's belief that moral and ethical values are not absolute but are contingent upon historical, cultural, and social contexts. The relativistic approach of postmodern thinkers encourages us to consider how different societies and cultures shape what is considered true, moral, or just, with no one system being superior or universal. This perspective aligns with Nietzsche's view that there is no one-size-fits-all morality, and instead, individuals and cultures must create their own values. However, Nietzsche's influence on postmodernism is not entirely uncritical. While Nietzsche's perspectivism suggests a world where multiple truths can coexist, some postmodern thinkers, particularly in the realms of politics and ethics, have pushed further into the implications of relativism. For instance, Derrida and Foucault questioned how an overemphasis on the subjectivity of truth might result in the breakdown of any meaningful basis for ethics or social justice. Nietzsche himself was wary of nihilism, which could arise from rejecting all objective truths, as it risks leading to the erosion of meaning and value in life. Nevertheless, Nietzsche's impact on postmodernism is profound. His ideas about the fragmentation of truth and the relativity of knowledge have deeply influenced the postmodern critique of the Enlightenment project, especially its faith in reason and objective facts. In the postmodern view, truth is never neutral or disinterested. It is always shaped by the forces of history, language, and power. In this way, Nietzsche's challenge to absolute truths paved the way for a philosophical movement that embraces pluralism, challenges grand narratives, and sees truth as fluid, constructed, and deeply intertwined with the complexities of human experience. Ultimately, postmodernism builds on Nietzsche's critique of absolute truth by embracing a more flexible, decentralized approach to knowledge. One that acknowledges the multiplicity of truths and the importance of questioning established systems of meaning. In a world that constantly shifts and changes, the postmodern rejection of fixed truths offers an opportunity to embrace the fluid, evolving nature of human understanding. Nietzsche's rejection of absolute truths is intricately tied to his critique of traditional morality. For Nietzsche, morality is not a universal, unchanging set of laws handed down by divine or objective forces. Instead, morality is a human construct, shaped by cultural, historical, and psychological factors. Nietzsche's critique of traditional morality, particularly the Christian moral system, is one of the cornerstones of his philosophy. He argued that moral systems, especially those grounded in religious or metaphysical beliefs, are arbitrary and do not reflect any inherent or universal truths about human nature. In Nietzsche's view, traditional morality, with its emphasis on values like humility, meekness, and self-sacrifice, arose from a slave morality, a moral system created by the oppressed and weak in order to protect themselves from the more powerful, master, class. Master morality, on the other hand, represents the values of strength, power, nobility, and the will to assert oneself. Nietzsche believed that the Christian moral system, which became dominant in the West, was a slave morality that glorified weakness, suffering, and submission, while devaluing strength, vitality, and personal ambition. This master-slave morality framework reflects Nietzsche's broader view that moral values are not objectively true but are shaped by power dynamics and societal structures. According to Nietzsche, the master morality was the product of a small, powerful elite that created values to justify their dominance and to glorify their qualities, such as courage, vitality, and assertiveness. In contrast, the slave morality developed among the weaker, oppressed classes. It was born out of a resentment of the master's strength and power, and it advocated for values that elevated meekness, humility, and submission, often as a way to cope with their powerlessness. This resentment, Nietzsche believed, led to the creation of an entire moral system that celebrated suffering and weakness as virtues while condemning the characteristics that the ruling class upheld as good. One of Nietzsche's key critiques of traditional morality is its otherworldly focus, especially in Christianity. Nietzsche saw Christianity's focus on the afterlife as a denial of life and vitality in the present. Christian morality, with its emphasis on the pursuit of virtue for the sake of eternal salvation, encouraged people to reject worldly pleasures and aspirations in favor of a future that may or may not ever arrive. In Nietzsche's words, Christianity promoted a life-denying morality that was antagonistic to the affirmation of life itself. In his Zarathustra and other works, Nietzsche famously challenges the idea of self-denial and asceticism, urging people to embrace life, passion, and vitality as values in themselves, rather than waiting for some abstract reward in the afterlife. Nietzsche's critique of morality also touches on the role of guilt and ressentiment in shaping ethical systems. He believed that traditional moral systems, particularly Christian morality, were deeply entwined with feelings of guilt, shame, and resentment. The slave morality, for example, emerges from a sense of ressentiment, a bitter, pent-up resentment felt by the weak toward the strong. Rather than confronting their oppressors, the weak internalized their powerlessness, developing a moral framework that devalued strength and celebrated suffering. This, Nietzsche argued, led to a cycle where the weak turned their inferiority into a moral virtue, glorifying submission and passivity as moral ideals. In this way, moral systems became tools for social control, justifying the suffering of the weak and perpetuating a cycle of oppression. Nietzsche also criticized the idea of universal morality that underpinned much of traditional ethical thinking. He rejected the notion that there is a single set of moral laws that applies to all people at all times. For Nietzsche, this idea was not only simplistic but also destructive. It denied the complexity and diversity of human experience, imposing a rigid, one-size-fits-all moral code that stifled individual creativity and personal growth. Instead, Nietzsche advocated for the creation of individualized ethics, where each person develops their own values based on their unique circumstances, desires, and goals. He envisioned a morality that was not about adhering to preordained rules, but about affirming life and the individual's will to power, which could lead to the creation of new values and new ways of living. The heart of Nietzsche's critique is the rejection of moral absolutism. He believed that the traditional moral system, with its rigid rules and universal principles, was ultimately oppressive and stifling to human flourishing. Nietzsche's philosophy calls for a liberation from these inherited moral codes, urging individuals to create their own values rather than follow imposed standards. This is reflected in his famous concept of the Übermensch, or Overman, an individual who transcends traditional moral constraints and creates new values to live by. The Übermensch does not live according to the dictates of external authorities but instead follows their own will and desires, fully embracing life's complexities and challenges. Nietzsche's critique of traditional morality thus has far-reaching implications for both individual freedom and social structures. It challenges the very foundations of conventional ethical systems, encouraging individuals to break free from inherited norms and to embrace a more authentic, life-affirming morality that is in tune with their own inner drives and instincts. It also forces us to confront the power dynamics behind moral systems, highlighting how certain values may be used to justify domination and subjugation, rather than the flourishing of all individuals. Through this critique, Nietzsche pushes us to reconsider not only what we consider good but also why we hold certain values in the first place. Nietzsche's view of knowledge is inextricably linked to his critique of absolute truths. He believed that knowledge, much like truth, is not fixed or permanent but is inherently dynamic and subject to change over time. For Nietzsche, the idea that knowledge can be static or immutable is an illusion, one that serves to prop up traditional systems of power and authority. Instead, Nietzsche saw knowledge as something fluid, constantly shifting and evolving in response to new perspectives, discoveries, and interpretations. One of the central ideas of Nietzsche's philosophy is the notion that truth and knowledge are not objective, universal, or external to human experience. Instead, they are shaped by historical, cultural, and psychological forces. This means that what we understand to be true today may no longer be seen as true tomorrow. In Nietzsche's view, knowledge is not a matter of uncovering a hidden, pre-existing reality, but rather a process of interpretation and reinterpretation, with each new perspective contributing to the unfolding complexity of human understanding. This perspective stands in stark contrast to traditional philosophical and scientific views that treat knowledge as an objective, unchanging entity to be discovered. Nietzsche saw this as a form of metaphysical dogmatism, which seeks to anchor knowledge in something outside of the flux of life. For example, Western science has often treated certain truths, such as the laws of physics, as timeless and universal. Nietzsche would argue that even these truths are interpretations, contingent on the historical and cultural contexts in which they arise. What we consider scientific facts today may, in the future, be overturned or modified by new discoveries or alternative paradigms. Nietzsche's rejection of permanent, fixed knowledge also ties into his critique of scientific objectivity. While science is often held up as the model of objective, neutral knowledge, Nietzsche believed that even scientific knowledge is influenced by the perspectives of those who create it. Scientific theories and paradigms are shaped by the values, assumptions, and biases of the scientists who produce them. In this sense, even scientific knowledge cannot be considered absolutely objective. The history of science is replete with examples where widely accepted truths were later disproven, such as the shift from the geocentric to the heliocentric model of the universe or the transition from Newtonian mechanics to quantum physics. This reflects Nietzsche's view that knowledge is not an unchanging body of facts but a living, evolving process. One of the most profound implications of Nietzsche's view on the fluidity of knowledge is the rejection of absolute certainty. For Nietzsche, knowledge is always tentative, provisional, and subject to change. He believed that human beings should embrace this uncertainty, acknowledging that their understanding of the world is always partial and incomplete. This recognition of the fluidity of knowledge allows for a more humble, open-minded approach to learning and discovery. Instead of clinging to fixed truths or rigid doctrines, individuals are encouraged to remain open to new interpretations and insights that may challenge or expand their current understanding. Furthermore, Nietzsche's view of knowledge as fluid is intimately connected to his concept of the will to power. The will to power is not just about physical dominance or control over others. It is also about the drive to shape one's own reality, to create meaning, and to influence the world according to one's own values. In the context of knowledge, the will to power manifests in the way individuals and societies assert their interpretations of reality and impose them on others. Knowledge is thus not a neutral or passive phenomenon but an active process of shaping and reshaping the world through the lens of individual and collective will. The more a person engages with this process, the more they can contribute to the dynamic development of knowledge. Nietzsche's fluidity of knowledge also has implications for historical understanding. He believed that history itself is subject to interpretation, and that what we consider historical facts are always colored by the perspective of those who write them. History is not a straightforward account of events but a narrative shaped by the biases and values of the historian. Nietzsche's famous idea of the eternal return, the cyclical nature of time and the repetition of events, serves as a metaphor for this understanding of history. Just as knowledge is constantly revisited and reinterpreted, so too is history continuously rewritten, with new insights and perspectives reshaping our understanding of the past. This understanding of knowledge as fluid and relational has a profound impact on fields like ethics, politics, and art. In ethics, for example, Nietzsche's rejection of fixed moral truths means that moral values must be seen as contingent and open to reinterpretation. Instead of relying on universal moral codes, individuals are tasked with creating their own values based on their experiences, desires, and circumstances. This approach encourages greater personal freedom and the exploration of new ways of being, rather than conforming to inherited systems of morality that may no longer be relevant. In politics, Nietzsche's view of the fluidity of knowledge challenges the idea that political ideologies or systems can ever provide definitive, unchanging solutions to social problems. Political structures and ideas are, like knowledge, shaped by historical and cultural forces, and they too are subject to change as new perspectives emerge. Nietzsche's thought encourages us to recognize the temporary and contingent nature of all political systems and to be open to the possibility of change and evolution in response to new challenges. In art, Nietzsche's emphasis on the fluidity of knowledge and interpretation opens the door for creative freedom. Just as knowledge and truth are not fixed, art too can be seen as an evolving form of expression, with no definitive or objective interpretation. Art is a space where meaning is continually constructed and deconstructed, allowing for a multiplicity of viewpoints and experiences to coexist. Nietzsche's idea of the artist-philosopher suggests that creativity is not just about producing works of beauty but about challenging existing norms, pushing the boundaries of thought, and offering new ways of experiencing the world. In summary, Nietzsche's fluidity of knowledge challenges the conventional understanding of knowledge as something stable, fixed, and universal. It encourages a dynamic, ever-evolving engagement with truth, one that is open to new perspectives, reinterpretations, and discoveries. By acknowledging the provisional and subjective nature of knowledge, Nietzsche opens up a space for greater freedom in how we understand the world and how we engage with the ongoing process of learning, meaning-making, and self-overcoming. Nietzsche's rejection of absolute truths is intricately tied to his critique of traditional morality. For Nietzsche, morality is not a universal, unchanging set of laws handed down by divine or objective forces. Instead, morality is a human construct, shaped by cultural, historical, and psychological factors. Nietzsche's critique of traditional morality, particularly the Christian moral system, is one of the cornerstones of his philosophy. He argued that moral systems, especially those grounded in religious or metaphysical beliefs, are arbitrary and do not reflect any inherent or universal truths about human nature. In Nietzsche's view, traditional morality, with its emphasis on values like humility, meekness, and self-sacrifice, arose from a slave morality, a moral system created by the oppressed and weak in order to protect themselves from the more powerful, master class. Master morality, on the other hand, represents the values of strength, power, nobility, and the will to assert oneself. Nietzsche believed that the Christian moral system, which became dominant in the West, was a slave morality that glorified weakness, suffering, and submission, while devaluing strength, vitality, and personal ambition. This master-slave morality framework reflects Nietzsche's broader view that moral values are not objectively true but are shaped by power dynamics and societal structures. According to Nietzsche, the master morality was the product of a small, powerful elite that created values to justify their dominance and to glorify their qualities, such as courage, vitality, and assertiveness. In contrast, the slave morality developed among the weaker, oppressed classes. It was born out of a resentment of the master's strength and power, and it advocated for values that elevated meekness, humility, and submission, often as a way to cope with their powerlessness. This resentment, Nietzsche believed, led to the creation of an entire moral system that celebrated suffering and weakness as virtues while condemning the characteristics that the ruling class upheld as good. One of Nietzsche's key critiques of traditional morality is its otherworldly focus, especially in Christianity. Nietzsche saw Christianity's focus on the afterlife as a denial of life and vitality in the present. Christian morality, with its emphasis on the pursuit of virtue for the sake of eternal salvation, encouraged people to reject worldly pleasures and aspirations in favor of a future that may or may not ever arrive. In Nietzsche's words, Christianity promoted a life-denying morality that was antagonistic to the affirmation of life itself. In his Zarathustra and other works, Nietzsche famously challenges the idea of self-denial and asceticism, urging people to embrace life, passion, and vitality as values in themselves, rather than waiting for some abstract reward in the afterlife. Nietzsche